Great. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you. I'm Kim Hart at Axios, and I write the weekly Axios Cities newsletter that launched about 6 months ago. And I have to say that part of the inspiration for that line of coverage started when I tagged along with Steve on one of his Rise of the Rest bus tours a couple of years ago, and really started to see this divergence theme that Mark went into such great detail about a few minutes ago. But so I wanted to start off with asking you, Steve, what was it that tipped you off to this dynamic so early? As Mark said, that you were one of the first people to really draw a lot of attention to this diverging paths of cities and the economic futures.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. I love that Brookings and with Mark and others is really shining a spotlight on this, and also hats off to Axios and Kim in particular, launching Axios Cities to really make it a priority. For me, it started almost a decade ago. I kind of stumbled into it. I was asked to co-chair something called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship here as part of the Commerce Department. That led to a series of recommendations, including that the White House launched an initiative called Startup America, which President Obama did. And he asked me to chair that, so that got me kind of traveling around trying to understand what was happening. And also led to things like the Jobs Act, jumpstarting our Business Startups Act and Opportunity Zones and other things, kind of from a policy standpoint. And I was frankly shocked when I started looking at the data. It was something I hadn't really been paying attention to, that essentially all the job creation in this country comes from startups, young, new companies, not from small business, not from big business. They each account for a lot of jobs in aggregate, but don't account as sectors for a lot of job growth. So it mostly is the young companies. Yet there's a huge, as Mark talked about, imbalance between the capital that most people need to start companies. Maybe you have some family money, but most people don't. If you're going to start a company, you usually need to raise some capital. And right now, it overwhelmingly is skewed to a few geographies. Last year, 75% of venture capital went to 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts, 75%. So states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Virginia, each get less than 1%. Last year, California alone got more than 50%. That then triggers a brain drain, where people who are growing up in different parts of the country, going to some of the best universities, and whether it be kind of Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh or Michigan in Ann Arbor or kind of Illinois, Chicago, Wisconsin, Madison, et cetera, then leave those places because the opportunity doesn't really exist there. They have to go someplace where the opportunity is. And then the combination of all the capital being there plus all the talent essentially moving there, creates this really strong increasing returns network effect there, but disadvantages other parts of the country. So that's how we kind of got into it. And then we launched Rise of the Rest about 5 years ago and said, rather than just talk about this from a policy standpoint, let's hit the ground, see what's happening, try to identify promising entrepreneurs, try to drag along some coastal venture capitalists, try to do what we can to help catalyze stronger, more thriving, rising kind of startup cities. And so far, we've done 8 of these tours. We visited 43 cities, and we also created a Rise of the Rest seed fund that so far invested in 130 companies in 70 cities in 30 states. And we are seeing great entrepreneurs who are building remarkable companies outside of places like Silicon Valley.
And you just launched your second fund, in fact.
We did. We decided that Revolution has a venture group and a growth group, but with the seed group, we decided rather than go our normal route, which was more institutional investors, foundations, and so forth, we would go out to individual investors and try to identify and connect with some of the most visible, respected people in the country, entrepreneurs like Jeff Bezos of Amazon, or Howard Schultz of Starbucks, or Eric Schmidt of Google, or venture capital investors like John Doerr and Jim Breyer, or private equity investors like Henry Kravis, David Rubenstein, hedge fund investors like Ray Dalio. Basically, we said, let's go reach out to people like that and try to create together a fund And that's what we did. We did our first fund a couple of years ago, did a second fund just a few months ago with this group of I think it's about 40 investors now. Together, it's about $300 million that we're investing in partnership with regional funds. We don't lead rounds, we don't take board seats. We're trying to catalyze more capital at this local kind of regional level and help in the process accelerate the growth of new regional venture funds and help some of the existing regional funds scale to the next level.
And are you starting to see the cycle break, the one that you've noticed over the past decade, and one that a lot of people woke up to after the 2016 election when they started to realize that people were living in very different realities depending on what kind of city and where region you live in? Are you starting to see not just lip service and people talking about, oh, this is a big problem, we should do something about this, and actually seeing some progress towards breaking the cycle?
I think we're seeing some progress. It's still early. It reminds me of the early days of the internet when we started AOL in 1985. So what's that? 35 years ago?
Don't do the math.
35 years ago, only 3% of people were online, and those 3% were online 1 hour a week. And we said we want to get America online, and most people thought, well, people don't want to get online. Like, well, that's not going to happen. That seems kind of weird. Maybe a few hobbyists, but it's never going to be like a big deal. And for about a decade, they were right. It was slow and hard and struggle and a whole host of reasons. But eventually it broke through, and now, of course, we've gone from a situation where nobody knew about or cared about the internet to everybody's connected, and you kind of can't live without it. So I saw this, sometimes it takes a while for ideas to get traction. Often kind of revolutions happen in more evolutionary ways. So with Rise the Rest, it feels similar. It feels like people are starting to pay attention. They're starting to, a little more capital, a little more attention, more events like this. 60 Minutes did something on this last year. So a little bit more, focus, but there's still a lot of work to do to scale it. But it does tie in, as you said, and also Mark said, with the political equation. I mentioned that 75% of the capital went to 3 states. If you looked at the last presidential election, if you added up all the states that President Trump won, which was 30 states, in aggregate, all of those states together had 15% of venture capital. The 20 states that Secretary Clinton won had 85% of venture capital. So when people were talking about, given the role startups play in job creation, economic vitality, and so forth, when people say there are parts of the country that felt left behind, they actually were being left behind. Just if you look at the data. So how do you get more capital to more of those entrepreneurs and more of those places? How do you reverse that brain drain and do you create a boomerang of people returning? We're also starting to see, we're seeing some early data where some of the universities, people like Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, for example, that 10 years ago overwhelmingly would leave, now more are staying there. We're seeing in a number of cities like Detroit where people left are now returning because there's a sense something is happening there. So it's beginning to, we're starting to put some points on the board. We are starting to see some breakout successes. We have a couple kind of unicorn kind of companies in our seed portfolio already, including one in Detroit. Another company we backed at Revolution is called Tempest, and it's based in Chicago. It's gone from a startup 4 years ago to now nearly 1,000 people. They're doing some really interesting things with AI and machine learning around oncology, trying to be more precise about diagnosing cancer and predicting what the right therapies are. They're working with 70% of the National Cancer Institute hospitals. Something like 30% of all cancer patients in this country now have their data in the Tempest system. And that is not in Silicon Valley. That is not in Boston or Cambridge. That is in Chicago. And the other variables that I think are going to accelerate in the next decade, and this was part of this book I wrote, The Third Wave, a few years ago, is place is going to matter more. Obviously, Rise of the Rest. Policy is going to matter more. The sector's up for disruption in this next wave, whether it be health tech or ag tech or smart cities or what have you. There is a policy regulatory kind of overlaid to them. And partnerships are going to matter more, that it's not just about the software. That's sort of the table stakes, being able to get that software embedded in system level change, like in the healthcare system, is where the real action is. So I think the center of gravity is shifting from where the second wave of the internet was about software and apps and virality and so forth, Facebook and et cetera, to basically disrupting some of the most fundamental industries, the most important aspects of our lives. But the playbook is going to be different. Place is going to matter more because the expertise in these sectors often is in the middle of the country. The partnerships you need are often in the middle of the country. And you're also going to have to be much more thoughtful and sensitive around some of the policy implications.
And a lot of the regions that are in the cities that you just mentioned have something in common, in that they have large universities and research institutions there that are helping to put out funding, attract really high caliber talent. What role do you see institutions like that, particularly universities, playing in drawing some of the center of gravity back to some of these cities?
Yeah, different universities are doing different things, but they are beginning to recognize they need to be much more entrepreneurial and figure out ways to take some of the ideas, the intellectual property that's developed there, and get it into the marketplace, and figure out ways to better serve the students that are there that have more of an aptitude, interest in being more entrepreneurial. And some are doing it better than others, but more and more are beginning to realize that's sort of where the focus needs to be. They're also doing a better job, the ones where the cities that are thriving, in connecting to other parts of the community. One of the things that was surprising to us when we first kind of hit the road with our Rise the Rest bus was how fragmented and siloed some of these communities are. Even relatively small communities, that people are just doing their own thing, but there's not enough collaboration across the community. So having the university work together with some of the larger companies, the Fortune 500 companies, and connect with the smaller startups, the entrepreneurs, and work with the mayor or the governor and nonprofits that are doing different things around the community. That convening collaboration aspect is critically important. And if the university is kind of off on the side, not really at the center of the community, or it's more focused on kind of just doing things the way they traditionally did and not connecting to the startup community in their area, then those cities will not thrive as much as if you really have that collaboration.
There also seems to be a cultural gap and differences between the top 2 to 5% of metro areas that Mark's charts pointed to, and the other kind of left behind areas when it comes to attitudes towards entrepreneurship and taking that kind of risk. It doesn't seem to be as much in the DNA of a small town in Indiana or Illinois as it is kind of baked into where you are in Seattle and San Francisco and Boston, where it's the badge of honor to have a failed startup. That's not something that people have the luxury of even thinking about in other parts of the country, where they're underwater on their mortgages. They have student debt that ended up not paying off. They just don't have the ability to take that leap. So how do you kind of bridge that gap as someone who is, your business is investing in entrepreneurs and getting people to take that leap of faith to find the next big thing?
That is true. And it's one of the other things that was a little bit of a surprise when we started getting this. We kind of understood the capital gap issue and had some ideas of how to deal with that. We understood the talent gap, this brain drain kind of issue, and had some views on that. But the surprise was how many communities we visited are kind of cautious and risk averse and a little more skeptical of entrepreneurs. I have my criticisms of Silicon Valley. There are some things that I don't love, but there are some aspects that are unbelievable, and one of them is that sense of possibility, that almost that fearlessness as they look at ideas. And the way I frame it as I travel around is, if you are hearing a startup pitch, do you first mentally focus on why it might fail, what might go wrong, the risk factors, or why it might succeed? And if it does succeed, what might be possible there? Silicon Valley does the latter. It's like, wow, I can see how that could be transformative, and that happens, this happens, this happens. A lot of parts of the country are more focused on, when they hear these ideas, like, here's why it won't work. And so part of what we're trying to do is get these communities to be a little more open to that idea of risk, a little more tolerant of, as you say, entrepreneurs. Many successful entrepreneurs who stumble the first time or two, and then finally kind of hit their stride. Changing the culture around entrepreneurship is as important, perhaps the harder one to change than the issue around capital and talent. We think getting those working together are going to be the key ingredient. One thing that helps, not surprisingly, is success. When you have a breakout company, we saw this with AOL here in the Washington, D.C. area. Indianapolis has benefited from this with ExactTarget, which was acquired by Salesforce. Now it's the second largest Salesforce office outside of San Francisco, having 2,000 employees there. Salt Lake City, where I'm going tomorrow, now Provo has a half a dozen multi-billion-dollar enterprise kind of software companies. You'll hear from Judy and Epic in terms of the role they played in letting people in Madison who are graduating there say, well, maybe I don't have to leave, I can stay, and creating a stronger startup ecosystem there. We have a number of investments through our Rise the Rest fund in Madison. Success begets success, momentum begets momentum, and also what happens naturally is when companies get to a certain scale, some of the early kind of pioneers want to go do something else, and so they launch new companies, and when the company has success, some people in the company or investors, early investors in the area invest in the company, have some capital, and they want to invest it in the next kind of range of startups. So I think it's possible. The other two things I mentioned are that if you look at Silicon Valley, I was speaking at a conference, a TechCrunch Disrupt conference a couple of years ago. There may be 2,000 people in the audience, and I asked for a show of hands of how many people were from the Bay Area. Less than 5%. Essentially, everybody in Silicon Valley is from someplace else. It's not that that's this magical kind of cauldron of creativity. It's the people who were creative and had a desire to be part of this innovation economy moved there. And so how do you create more of that opportunity in more places so they can stay where they are or even return to where they're from? And the last point is, if you think about the arc of innovation in the last 30, 40 years, certainly particularly with the internet, that this last 20 years, the second wave, no question, Silicon Valley has dominated. And the big breakout successes have overwhelmingly been Silicon Valley. But if you look at the first wave, the first 20 years, companies like AOL, as I mentioned, were here. IBM's PC operations were in Boca Raton, Florida. Dell was in Austin, Texas. Gateway was in South Dakota. The big communications modem company, Hayes, was in Atlanta. Sprint was in Kansas City. CompuServe was in Columbus, Ohio. I could tick through dozens of these examples. That first wave, it actually was more regionally distributed. It was only when it was a second wave, when it became so centered around software and coding, that Silicon Valley kind of dominated. In this third wave, because, as I mentioned, the industry's up for grabs and the skill sets and the partnerships are more dispersed, there is an opportunity for many cities to rise and go from a few cities dominating to a few dozen cities really thriving, but only if people at the local level, as well as more of the regional and national level, make it a priority and say, we care about our community, we care about the seed corn of backing the startups today, some of which will end up being the big companies tomorrow, and we care about leveling the playing field so everybody everywhere really has a shot at the American dream, has a shot if they have an idea of building a startup, as opposed to saying, if you're in most parts of the country, too bad, unless you go there or there or there, you don't get to participate.
And this is really being driven by the innovation economy, as Robin Mark's research has shown, among other research out there. And so and the tech industry seems to be seeing that it's reaching a bit of a crisis moment for them as well. While they have been the beneficiaries of this enormous success and growth in their big hubs that they've really built and turned into these superstar cities, people can't afford to live there. They're having a harder time recruiting people there. They're getting a lot more pressure on what their impact has been in their own backyard and the larger national economic dynamics. When you're talking to business leaders in that sector in particular, what are you hearing and what are you telling them about how they need to invest or participate in that next wave?
What's happened, particularly in the last 5 years, has been pretty interesting and gives me kind of hope that we're kind of at a tipping point. Because now the big companies in Silicon Valley recognize they need to have a more distributed workforce. They cannot continue to scale in Silicon Valley. It's super expensive. There's a mercenary culture. People don't stay with companies kind of very long. So all the big companies, Facebook, Google, et cetera, have developed strategies around kind of building up regional presence. Amazon, of course, had this celebrated second headquarters effort, and which led to this area, the Northern Virginia area. But they also put 5,000 people in Nashville, and they're starting to put people in large number, thousands of people in a lot of different places. So the big companies are essentially starting to distribute their workforce. The other dynamic that just happened fairly recently is now the venture capitalists that 10, 15 years ago said, I'll only invest in you if you move to where I am, now are recognizing investing in these other companies, other places, kind of makes sense, and even telling the companies in Silicon Valley they're investing in, what's your second office strategy? If you get to a certain scale, where will you go next, and why? And getting them thinking earlier about trying to kind of have a somewhat more kind of regionally distributed workforce. Those are, I think, game changers in terms of the psychology that's starting to kick in. It'll take a number of years for that really to kind of fully kind of be deployed, but I think it's encouraging. I also should say, even though the focus of this event appropriately is on kind of regional entrepreneurship, innovation, job creation, if you look at the venture capital data, there are other places that we need to be sensitive about. Last year, over 90% of venture capital in this country went to men, less than 10% to women. Last year, less than 1% went to African Americans. So even though we are the most innovative entrepreneurial nation, the reality is it does matter where you live, it does matter what you look like, it does matter who you know, and we need to kind of level the playing field. And it's not just we should do that because it's the right thing to do. Of course, it is the right thing to do. I don't believe this country can continue to be the leader, the most innovative entrepreneurial nation with global competition, China, others kind of really stepping up their game, unless we do have a more broadly distributed innovation economy, and we do let everybody who has great ideas take those ideas and try to scale them into major companies. We have this within the country dynamic that Mark talked about of how this innovation economy and the dynamics are kind of impacting our politics in a pretty meaningful way. But also, if we look at the next half century, what was a little startup country 250 years ago, and is now the leader of the pack, will not remain the leader of the pack unless we're winning the innovation battle. And we cannot win the innovation battle if it's basically a few people in a few places that we have all our eggs in those baskets.
And since you mentioned politics, and given the year that we are now in, my last question for you will be along those lines. Regardless of who wins the White House this year and what party ends up in power, what do you think the federal government should be doing policy-wise to try to reinforce some of the ideas that you're talking about? Because I think that people are very worried that the cycle isn't going to break on its own.
I think some of the experience I had, particularly 7 or 8 years ago, around things like the Jobs Act, and then more recently with the Opportunity Zone legislation, was encouraging in that jobs, economic growth, innovation, entrepreneurship, startups is actually one of the few areas where there actually is broad bipartisan support. I don't run into people saying, I'm really not for startups creating new jobs and innovating. I'm not for figuring out ways to be more inclusive and kind of figure out a better way to kind of distribute talent and capital and opportunity and so forth. So that gives me some comfort in what is now obviously a hyper-partisan city, that once we get through this election, there is an opportunity for people to come together, and having Brookings and other people focusing on things, putting ideas on the table, so that when it's time to have that conversation, there really is a vigorous focus on what can we do as a country to remain the most entrepreneurial nation, what can we do within our country to be more inclusive, to kind of level the playing field and help more people in more places, help more cities kind of rise, help more people rise, help more ideas kind of flourish. I think there is an opportunity to do that. I've seen that a couple of times. I think we'll see that again in the next couple of years. So now's the time time while everybody's duking it out over impeachment or over Iowa, New Hampshire, what have you, to say, let's use this year to basically kind of put the ideas on the table so next year we can move that innovation agenda and do everything we can to try to maximize the likelihood that America remains the leader of the pack from an innovation standpoint, and also maximize the ability to level the playing field in terms of opportunity.
Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.